It was getting dark, and I was passing through a forest where each tree whispers ancient secrets and the wind carries stories from time immemorial. Pedro began his journey. He had left a job interview in a distant state, and instead of rushing back, he chose to turn the return trip into an adventure, a tribute to the free spirit of his ancestors. The rain drummed on the car roof, a rhythmic melody that would normally calm his soul. However, the road ahead of him wound through a dense forest, with trees so ancient they seemed to touch the sky. The twilight plunged the path into deep shadows, and the wet asphalt glistened under the faint headlights. Pedro checked his phone and noticed that there were 52 miles to the next turn. Strangely, Apple Maps indicated a different route than the one he knew. Without much thought, he followed the new path, trusting the technology like many of his generation. After about 30 minutes, a discomfort began to grow. Looking at the phone again, he saw that the distance to the turn hadn't changed, and his car seemed stationary on the map. He tried restarting the app, but it was frozen, showing only turn right in 50. With no street names or landmarks, Pedro felt disoriented. He kept driving, hoping that once he left the forest, the signal would return to normal. But the rain continued to fall, heavy and relentless, and the forest seemed endless. The miles passed slowly, as if he were trapped in an eternal cycle. Then he saw an intersection approaching, and beside it, a parked truck. The vehicle, large and imposing, seemed out of place on that lonely and deserted road. A sense of unease began to settle in. Who else would be there, in the middle of the night, facing the same challenge as him? He slowed down and looked at the street sign. A flash of recognition crossed his mind. He had seen that name before. With his heart beating a little faster, Pedro decided to take a chance. He turned the wheel and followed that lesser-known road, believing that his memory would provide the necessary guidance. Initially, confidence drove him. The trees seemed to part for him, like guardians of his choice. But as he progressed, doubt began to creep in. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly. Hours passed, and Pedro was still surrounded by shadows and rain. What was supposed to be a short trip was turning into an endless labyrinth. He looked at his phone again. The GPS was still frozen, offering no help. The feeling of being lost began to weigh on his shoulders, but he held on to the hope that everything would make sense soon. Then he saw a light ahead. A motel, emerging unexpectedly in the darkness. The motel seemed like something from a different time, with its neon sign flickering intermittently. The parking lot was deserted, which heightened the sense of isolation. Pedro parked the car, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, listening to the steady sound of rain hitting the roof. There was something unsettling about the scene, but he was determined to find out where he was and how to get out of there. As he tried once more to get his phone to work, Pedro noticed the truck he had seen earlier at the intersection pulling into the motel parking lot. His heart beat faster. The rain made it hard to see clearly, but he could make out the silhouette of the driver getting out of the vehicle. Ignoring the man, Pedro focused on his phone, desperately trying to reconnect to the outside world. After several minutes without success, Pedro decided he needed help. He grabbed his car key and quickly got out, running to the motel entrance. The front room was dark and empty, a sense of abandonment hanging in the air. He leaned over the reception desk, calling out for someone who could assist him. But there was no response, only the distant sound of rain and the electric hum of the neon sign outside. Then the front door opened behind him. Pedro turned slowly, his heart racing as he saw the man from the truck standing in the doorway. The stranger was drenched, water dripping from his long hair and beard. His expression was cold and sinister, and one of his hands was hidden in his pocket as if concealing something. Pedro tried to move past the man quickly, but he positioned himself firmly in the way, not saying a word. The tension in the air was palpable, and Pedro knew he needed to get out of there immediately. He squared his shoulders and, with a swift movement, managed to squeeze past the man and run to his car. As he walked quickly, he could hear the stranger's footsteps following him, getting closer. Pedro got into the car and locked the doors just as the man reached the window. Through the rain, he saw the man pull the handle forcefully, shaking the car. Pedro started the engine and sped away, nearly hitting the stranger as he fled the parking lot. With adrenaline pumping, Pedro drove quickly back to the intersection, determined to find a way out of the oppressive forest. But up ahead, he saw a faint light shining among the trees, a sign that there might be some sort of refuge or help. It wasn't the familiar light of the city or the safety of a gas station, but a pale and uncertain glow. As he got closer, the outline of a billboard emerged in the dim light. The rain turned the metal structure into a ghostly figure, and the word motel glowed faintly, like whispers from the past. The parking lot was empty except for his car and the large truck he had seen before. Pedro parked and remained in the car for a few moments, the engine still softly rumbling, the windshield wipers sweeping away the incessant rain. The sight of the truck in the parking lot made him uneasy. What did that man want? Why was he there? Gathering his courage, he got out of the car and ran toward the motel entrance. Each step in the rain sounded like thunder, the sound of his own feet echoing in his ears. The front door was dark, and as he approached, he noticed the interior was empty, with only a faint light illuminating the abandoned reception. Pedro leaned over the counter, calling out for someone, anyone, but silence was his only response. Suddenly, the door behind him creaked open with a sinister sound. Pedro turned quickly, and there he was, the man from the truck, drenched, with water dripping from his long hair and beard. His expression was cold and sinister. In a calculated movement, the man pulled something from his pocket, and Pedro froze, feeling panic rising up his spine. Without a second thought, Pedro tried to pass him. The man momentarily blocked the way, but made no move to stop him. Pedro squeezed his shoulders, slipped past him, and ran back to the car. The man's footsteps followed him, each thud on the wet pavement echoing like a war drum. Pedro got into the car and locked the doors, the sound of the lock clicking like a lifeline. The man reached the window and tried to open the door forcefully, shaking the car from side to side. Pedro started the engine and sped away, nearly hitting the man as he fled the parking lot. As he drove away, his heart still racing, his eyes caught a glimpse of something ahead. Through the rain, a sign glowed faintly in the darkness, promising refuge or perhaps something more sinister. After a few minutes of frantic driving, Pedro finally saw the lights of a small town ahead. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, but still didn't dare to slow down. He entered the town and drove to a brightly lit gas station, where he parked under the comforting light. The attendant looked at him curiously as Pedro got out of the car, still panting and drenched. "Are you okay?" the man asked, noticing the look of panic on Pedro's face. He nodded but knew he needed help. "I need a phone," he replied, and the attendant quickly handed him the device. Pedro called the police and told his story, from the mysterious GPS detour to the terrifying encounter at the abandoned motel. Within minutes, a patrol car arrived, and the officers took him to the station for a more detailed statement. As he recounted the events, Pedro learned that the motel he had been at had been closed for months. The sign still worked, but the place was abandoned. "It's like it's stuck in time," one of the officers said, intrigued. When asked about the man from the truck, Pedro realized how little he actually knew. Who was that man? What were his intentions? These questions lingered in the air without clear answers. But one thing was certain: Pedro was very lucky to have escaped. After leaving the police station, Pedro returned home, feeling exhausted but relieved. He sat in his living room, reflecting on the surreal experience. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with a sense of gratitude for being safe. Days later, while browsing the internet, Pedro found accounts of other people who had strange experiences in that same forest. It was as if the place had a power of its own, a sinister magnetism that drew in the unsuspecting. Despite the scare, Pedro decided he wouldn't let fear control him. The experience had changed him, but also made him stronger. He would continue to live his life, more cautious, yes, but also more aware of the world around him. And with an incredible story to tell, he knew he would always have something to share in conversations, a reminder that reality can be as mysterious as any fiction.